So as I told you last time, because of this story is a bit longer, I decided to split it into two. You'll find that some of our stories that coming up vary in length. Some are a little bit longer, so the next one is about 15 pages, but then the one after that is only about a page and a half. So trade-off between some longer, some shorter. So they all, I think overall our average is about 7 or 8 pages for the whole semester for each story. Average is about 7 or 8 pages. So, okay. So we saw in part 1 of Sarrazin, of course, that this was what we call the frame story, right? The frame narrative, right? In which we have, of course, our first person narrator, but our first person narrator is not actually involved directly in the story of Sarrazin, is he? Instead, he is part of this frame story. He's taken a date, right? And we'll find out more about in part 2, taking a date to a ball, a dance that's being held by this very rich family, the Delantes, right? No one knows who they are, where they come from, what their background is, nor their connection to a strange old man who is at the ball, right? And remember, at the end of part 1, we see that the narrator promises to tell his date, his lover, that he will tell her the story of who the Delantes are, who the old man is, if she will meet him alone the next evening, right? Okay, so part 2, of course, we have the story within the story. So the beginning of part 2, we see that the narrator and his date from the previous evening, they meet up again, even though he says, she's treating me badly, I'm not going to go. He says that at the end of part 1, but we see that he nonetheless does go, and he tells her this story about this sculptor. And when does we can assume that the frame story is happening around the time that this story is published, around 1830. Is the story of Sarrazin himself, is that 1830 as well? What time period is that? Yeah, we're told it's the mid-18th century. So yeah, when he goes to become the apprentice to Bouchardon, it's 1758. So it's set back in the middle of the 18th century, right? So it's set back quite a bit in time compared to the actual time period of our story. And we're going to see why Balzac does this and why it's important, right? Of course, it's also connected to become an old man like we see in part 1. You have to have lived for quite a while, so it needs that lapse of time, but there's also a contrast between two different eras and two different times, two different ways of thinking that Balzac is wanting us to look at here as well. Okay. So we find out that this guy, Sarrazin, from the title, is actually the name of the main character from the story within the story, right? And he is a young man from the provincial city of Besançon so he's not from Paris, he's not from a sort of like educated, sophisticated background. Instead, he's from a guy who had made his way up in the world from being a poor man to being a rich man through trade, and wants his son to then become like a politician. Unfortunately for him, or maybe fortunately, his son, Sarrazin, is not cut out at all for being a politician. Instead, he makes trouble at school, right? He gets kicked out for making like a very naughty version of Jesus, right? Carves we assume, some very crude, some very probably sexual vision of Jesus, and he gets kicked out of school for this. And so he then goes to Paris, right? And he goes to Paris and he becomes apprentice to a sculptor who is as we'll see, is a real life sculptor. Balzac takes this character from history. He's actually a real person. And so this guy, Bouchardon, takes him in and makes Sarrazin his apprentice, and he realizes that Sarrazin has a lot of potential, right? He's like, this guy is really smart, he's really talented, right? He has a very bad temperament, right? He's very passionate, very quick to anger, a very annoying kind of person, but he's really a talented sculptor. And so he convinces his father, even, right? He shows some of, Bouchardon shows Sarrazin's father some of his son's work, and he's like, this guy has talent, you should support him, and he does. So when he, after he has some experience and some training from Bouchardon, he does what many people of this time did, which is they go to Italy, right, to study the great masters of particularly the Renaissance, right, the Italian Renaissance. Right? And this isn't just a phenomenon that was happening for French artists. This was something that like many people across Europe did as part of their, even if they weren't artists, they would do this as part of their education. So particularly in England, this is part of the sort of seen as part of the gentleman, the rich person's education, was to take a journey from England down through France, see the historical and cultural artifacts in France, through Switzerland, down into Italy, go to places like Florence and Rome and so on, see the great works of art, and then make your way back to England if you were English, right? So this is sort of a trial or education that many people from across the continent would take in these times, particularly because of the historical and artistic achievements that had happened in Italy in the past, right? So he goes to Italy, right, and there he looks around all the different, famous works by artists, and he's inspired, but he's most inspired when he goes to the theater and he meets the other main character in this story within a story, and her name is La Zambinella. La Zambinella, right? Of course, that's just the stage name of this person, right? And Zambinella, he sees her on the stage singing. We assume that she's probably an opera singer, and he's like, wow, this person is perfect, right? Their body is perfect, their voice is perfect. He looks at, exchange glances, oh, her personality is perfect. You can see traces of the Sandman, right? When you can see the Olympia, where he projects all those ideas of his own, Nathaniel does, onto Olympia in the Sandman story. Very similar kind of thing happening here with the way in which Sarrazin looks at La Zambinella, right? And so, of course, being an artist, he studies her figure, he watches her at the theater, and he goes home, he draws sketches of her in all sorts of different poses and angles and directions and so on. And he then also makes a statue of Zambinella, right? He's like, this is the perfect woman, found the perfect woman. Right? So he keeps going back to the theater over and over again to see Zambinella. He keeps studying her, keeps drawing pictures of her. And in 123, we get these little jumps where we pull out of the narrative of Sarrazin and we jump back into the frame narrative. So 123, I want you to take note of this. Let's all turn to that page. 123 in our books. We have the end of the top paragraph, and then we just have two short parts here where we jump back into the frame narrative on 123, right? Just these two short paragraphs here. But we're given a quite important clue that's very, very easy to miss, right? Now, the woman that the narrator is speaking to, she says to him, like, what's this got to do? Like, why are you telling me this story about Sarrazin? What's all this got to do, and Zambinella, what have they got to do with the old man and the Delantes, right? And the narrator says, well, it's got everything to do with them. You'll find out, right? But the other thing that we're told about this, and Balzac doesn't make a big deal about this, but it's something that if we're reading carefully, we'll notice. What is this woman's name? We're told there in that second paragraph. What is her name?
Of that woman's name there.
Yeah.
Madame de Rochefide.
Madame de Rochefide, yes. And what does this tell us about her? Okay, that's one thing certainly it tells us, which is not probably a surprise to us. So the de in a name usually tells us that someone is aristocratic in French society, yes. Tells us something else though. She's married, right? Is the narrator her husband? No, right? So this is something that is very easy to miss, but is there as dropped as this clue in the background, right? Is that like we found out in part one that like he's taking her on this is their first outing together, this is for the first time that they've gone on this sort of like this date, this meeting. And now he's meeting her at her house, right? But he's not her husband, right? Basically, he's trying to coax this woman into having an affair with him, right? And she's interested, right? She's gone to the dance with him. She's come to hear this story. But this whole time, she's testing him to see, oh, this guy worth cheating on my husband for? Right? And of course, we've seen from part one, the end of part one, that his whole strategy here is to say, hey, let's go back to your place tomorrow, just you and me. I'll tell you the story, right? No one else knows it, right? And then if you're impressed, you know, we can get together, right? So this whole story that we're reading about, this story within a story, is very carefully and cleverly constructed here by Balzac as a means of seduction, as a means of trying to entice this woman, Madame de Rochefide, into cheating on her husband with this narrator. Right? So that's what's going on in the background of this. Balzac doesn't highlight this at all for us. Right? He just drops these little clues that if we're reading carefully, we'll see there. Right? So yes, so this jump for a moment out of this telling the story of Sarrasine gives us some big clues here, big things here. Now, of course, at this point, we don't really know who Zambonella is either, right? We still haven't guessed the connection between the old man and Zambonella. So Balzac is also kind of teasing us as readers. This first time we're reading this, we're not going to get. We're also going to be saying, well, yeah, why is he telling this story? What is the connection between the old man? Like, is Sarrasine the old man, right? He's deliberately playing with us here. If you're reading it for the second or third or the millionth time like me, then you know, you're going to be like, oh, I know what he's doing here. Right? But very important clue here. Okay, so Zambonella keeps on seeing that Sarrasine is coming back and back and back, keeps coming back to see him. And so this sort of like this, well, at least Sarrasine believes that this connection starts to exist between them. And he is invited to go and to a sort of like theatre after party, if you like, with her, right? So there's like, you know, the performance, and then afterwards the actors all get together and they drink and they party and have fun like actors do. And so he goes along to this party, and there's all of the other, you know, famous theatre people there, and they're like, have fun, like go talk to her. And he's like, well, aren't there other people who are in love with her? And they're like, no. Remember, it's sort of like, again, like the Sandman, Olympia at the dance, and he's like, why does anyone want to dance with Olympia? Right? Well, here we have a similar thing, right? Where everyone's like, no, you go and talk to Zambonella, she's yours, right? And in this case, whereas Nathaniel in the previous story couldn't work out why people weren't interested in Olympia, here, instead, Sarrasine comes to the conclusion, oh, she must be just like a prostitute, right? They're like, oh, they realize that she's not really a challenge. They could pay for her, you know, anytime. So he decides that she may be like a sort of a prostitute, and so therefore this is why they are treating her this way. So the party goes on all night. They have lots of fun, right? The morning comes. He still hasn't managed to seduce Zambonella. She keeps on like pushing him away and saying, no, let's just be friends. I love you, but I can't be with you, kind of thing. The morning comes and he's like, well, you know, come on, tell me, like, you know, there's no chance of us sleeping together now because like the morning's here and, you know, we're too tired and it's not going to happen. But please tell me that you love me. And again, she reiterates this whole thing about, no, I just need a friend, I need a brother, I need someone to take care of me. I can't be what you want, right? And then the other actors say, hey, let's go for a day trip, right? We're all hungover, but let's go and have some fun. Let's go out to this villa, this country house rather, that is owned by the cardinal, who is the patron of Zambinella. And so again, this is Zarazin's chance to have some alone time with her. They ride along in carriage together, and he keeps on trying to pursue her without any luck. They come across a snake, and he kills the snake for her. He's like, oh, look what I did for you. You must love me. And they're also pursued by some bandits, but again, he's sort of like very protective of her. So after this incident, he goes to see to another event at the ambassador's house, and he's puzzled because he sees Zambinella there, and he's like, why is she dressed that way? She's dressed like a man. She's wearing a sword. She has, she's dressed in male clothing, and everyone's treating her like a man. And someone who's standing by him is like, what do you mean she? Zambinella? There's no female actors on the Roman stage. What are you talking about? Okay. And of course, this is where we see this cultural difference that Balzac is playing on, right? Is that as a young French man from the provinces, Sarrazin doesn't know about the tradition at this time in Italy of the castrato, right? Where, when boys, before they go through puberty, what are their voices like? Very high, right? Even higher than a woman's in some cases. So you can sing very high notes, right? But then when you go through puberty, of course, your voice drops, your voice breaks. You go through a period when you're like 12 or 13, and your voice keeps on going between high and low, and then eventually you become a man and your voice becomes deep, right? So in order to avoid that happening, what they would do is the most talented young boy singers, they would castrate them, right? So they would chop off their bits so that they could continue to sing high. So of course they would grow into adults, but they wouldn't grow into proper men, right? Because they didn't have the hormones and so on that are necessary to produce them into being proper like adult men. Instead, they're what we call a eunuch, right? Or castrato in this case. So this allows them to grow into full-grown adults, but they still have the high voice. They can still sing these high notes that young boys can. Okay. And Sarrazin doesn't want to believe it, right? He's like, no, that's not possible. I'm an artist. I know what a woman's like, right? I know what, I've been with her. Like, we went on the trip. We had a party. We hung out together. No way I've been tricked, right? And so he decides to go to her, and he has this plan to kidnap her, right? To steal her away and to find out for himself what's really going on. But before he can execute his plan, the cardinal, who is her patron, sends 3 assassins. They come in, they stab him to death, and of course, Sarrazin dies. And Zambinella, of course, goes on, as we find out earlier in the story, she goes on to have a very successful career as a great opera singer. Right? And then we jump back into the frame narrative at the end, and the narrator's like, so, what do you think of my story? You like me? Huh? Great story, huh? Now you know all about it. Now you know who the Delantes are. Now you know who Zambinella is. Right? And she's like, yeah, no, you just made me depressed. I don't like you. Right? And that's where the story ends. Right? He fails to impress her, and she doesn't sleep with him. Or doesn't have the affair with him. Okay, so, of course, there are a whole lot of references, a whole lot of symbols, a whole lot of meanings that we can attribute to this text, right? This is a very rich and very complex story. It has a lot of ideas in it, different ways of interpreting it. So I'm not going to cover all of the different angles that are possible here, but I'm going to look at some of the context, some of the background, and I'm going to suggest like I did with the earlier Balzac story, where I came up with 3 different readings of possible levels of meaning with A Passion in the Desert, 4 possible ways of approaching this particular story as well. So I've already mentioned the context of the castrato there. This is one of the most famous of the 18th century castrati. His name is Farinelli, right? Very, very famous opera singer. As I said, you can imagine just like how difficult it is to because even many women can't sing the high notes that these castrati were able to do, right? There is still a certain style of singing that some people are capable of even without being castrati, but it takes a lot of talent and natural talent, and it's called being a counter-soprano, right? Counter-soprano, being higher than a soprano, right? Really high notes. So this guy, Farinelli, right? I don't know if he was the model for Zambonella, but certainly there seem to be certain elements that Balzac may have drawn from his life. And as you can see there, he's dressed very richly. He was very, very successful. And he sort of has this artistic temperament that gets associated with those kinds of performers. So this, as you can even see from the term castrato, is you can see it has Italian origins. And that's because even though there were other places where this was done for the sake of singing, right? It's primarily an Italian tradition, right? And it hasn't happened for, I think the last castrato died in the early 20th century, right? So if you go into the internet, you can find out about the history of this. But it was a long tradition that occurred in Italy. But because remember, the explanation for why Sarrazin doesn't know about this, remember, he's just a young man from the provinces, right? And he's from France, right? So he doesn't have this cultural knowledge about Italy when he goes there. So when he arrives in Italy, when he arrives in Rome, everyone else who is there knows about it, right? They're like, well, yeah, we know Zambonella's not really a woman, but he doesn't know that. Right, because of this background. Okay, now we need to talk a little bit about, again, we've seen there are differences between the different romantic movements, right? We've seen that the American is different from the German, different from the English, different from the Americans, and so on. Right. One of the things that's a little bit different about the French version of Romanticism is that it had a much more specific kind of enemy, right? It had a much more specific thing that was rebelling against the many of the other kinds of romantic movements. And in particular, the style of art that had become popular in the 18th and into the early 19th century in France was a style known as neoclassicism, right? And neoclassicism claimed to try to return to the style of the Greeks and the Romans. Right? It didn't really, because there are lots of things about it that are not very Greek and not very Roman. But nonetheless, they wanted to achieve the artistic style. Right? So things that are considered very beautiful, straight lines, ideal beauty, right? Very perfect figures. These are the kinds of ideas and the kinds of styles that are favored by neoclassicism. And actually, the figure that Balzac chooses to put into his story, Bouchardon, as I told you, is a real-life figure, real-life historical figure. And this is his most famous work here. And you can see it is a neoclassical style of sculpture, right? It portrays, you can see, first of all, the style of it is it's designed, first of all, to be beautiful, to capture a kind of ideal beauty, right? And its actual topic here is classical as well because this is meant to be Cupid or Eros, depending which tradition you choose. And he's making the title of it is he's making a bow, like Cupid shoots arrows. He's making a bow out of a club used by Hercules. Right. So this is Bouchardon, the real Bouchardon's most famous sculpture. Classical in nature, but neoclassical in the sense that he's trying to reproduce a style that was originally done by the Greeks and Romans. So it looks sort of like a Greek and Roman statue, doesn't it? Except it also has more modern qualities about it that you can tell that it's not really. Okay. So this is the example that he chooses, and this let's take another look at a neoclassical style. This is a painting from the late 18th century by Jacques-Louis David, most famous for some of his paintings of the French Revolution. So particularly his painting of Marat, when he was one of the revolutionaries murdered by Charlotte Corday and dead in the bathtub, right? That famous picture. Well, this is another of this style of neoclassical painting, right? First of all, you want to know who this guy is? It's Socrates, right? So one of the most famous of the Greek philosophers, probably the most famous, right? And so it's not just the subject of the painting, the death of Socrates, because Socrates was put to death by the Athenians, but also, like, even if we look at some of the background and the style of this painting, right? Look at the way in which he uses the bricks, for example, to create lots of like straight lines to keep everything in a great deal of order. And even the archway here, right? Everything is very geometrical. Everything is very ordered, very rational, very like calm, and like everything is, everything makes sense. Everything is done very beautifully, right? Whereas when we move into Romanticism, the Romantics, of course, they're interested in order, but they're also interested in the kind of the chaos and the emotions and the things that overthrow this order as well at the same time. So this style, right, this attempt to return to a sort of what the 18th century or the neoclassicists imagined to be the Greek and Roman style, was something that dominated both painting, sculpture, theater. So if you're writing a play, you were supposed to follow like Aristotle's rules in the Poetics that Aristotle sets down for how to write a play, right? If you didn't follow the rules, there were big problems. So one of the most famous examples of this is Victor Hugo's play, published in the same year as this story, first performed 1830, right? Became known as a landmark in theater for the Battle of Ennani. Ennani was the title of the play that this is a sketch of people rioting when this play was put on because it didn't follow the neoclassical style. I mean, only in France, right? Riot about a play, right? Not because it has sex or violence or nudity or anything like that, but because it doesn't follow Aristotle's rules, right? People start a riot. So you can see people took this very seriously. It was really hard if you're going to be a painter or a poet or a sculptor. It was really hard because like the schools wouldn't take you in, they wouldn't support you, they wouldn't teach you, right? If you wanted to do your own style. And so the Romantics, it wasn't just a question of like stylistic rebellion. They had to stand up to like institutions that were like, you must do it this way, or you won't get an education, or you won't get funding, or you won't be supported, right? And so this rebellion against this style, against this neoclassical style, becomes one of the hallmarks of French Romanticism, right? So we can see that like Sarrazin himself is placed in this position where his teacher is Bouchardon, a neoclassicist, and when he goes and he first sees Zambonella, right, the way in which he measures her beauty is also by the standards that he imagines to have inherited from the Greeks and the Romans. So on page 121, for example, right, when he first sees Zambonella, right? So Sarrazin cried aloud with pleasure. He saw before him at that moment the ideal beauty whose perfections he had hitherto sought here and there in nature, taking from one model, often of humble rank, the rounded outline of a shapely leg, from another the contour of the breast, from another her white shoulders, stealing the neck of that young girl, yet the hands of this woman and the polished knees of yonder child, but never able to find beneath the cold skies of Paris the rich and satisfying creations of ancient Greece. Right? So his ideal of beauty, right, is borrowed from the styles, from the beauty that he sees from, particularly obviously from Greek sculpture, right? Those statues that we see of like either the emperors or the gods or heroes, right? Those are the style. He's like, oh wow, San Manella is like the living version of one of those statues, right? In which the Greeks and the Romans tended to try to idealize. It's like sort of like their version of Photoshop, right? It's like you create a sculpture of someone, but you make them more beautiful, make them more ideal, more muscular, and more defined and more beautiful than they really are, right? So when he sees San Manella, he measures her by these neoclassical standards. Now, there's a certain irony in him doing this, and this is something we hinted at in our last class when we looked at part 1, which is if we think about beauty today in our modern world, right? And this is true of Balzac's time as well. When we think about beauty, think about beauty magazines or who goes to beauty salons, who is it predominantly aimed at? Men or women? Right? Predominantly, if we open up a fashion magazine or a beauty magazine, going to be mostly female models. If we go to beauty shops, it's mostly going to be run by women, for women, right? And so our standard today for beauty is mostly based upon the ideas about female beauty. But this was not the case for the Greeks and the Romans, right? They had a rather different set of cultural values, right? Now, that's not to say, of course, that they didn't have females that they considered beautiful, right? Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was a woman. Helen of Troy, who caused the Trojan Wars, most beautiful woman at that time, right? But nonetheless, their main idea about beauty was based upon the male figure rather than upon the female figure. So one of the things that Balzac is able to do with thinking about like the classical versus the modern is that he's able to play upon, well, which one of them is it? Is it male beauty or female beauty? And he's able to play around with that idea through the figure of Zambonella because she is really neither of those things, given that she is not really a woman, and also because she's had her parts removed, is not really a man either, right? Is this zone in between. So Balzac is playing around with these differences between like the ancient world that inspired these things, inspired these ideas of beauty, and yet he's able to say, well, you know, these modern figures, they don't really follow, right, those same standards of beauty. Instead, they focus more upon female beauty, right? Okay. So in regard to this, one of we've seen already a number of different classical references back to like Greek myths and stories and so on. We saw, for instance, last time Adonis, right? We saw the historical reference of the Dolante's son to Antinous, right? Not the one from the Odyssey, but the one from Roman history. And here in today's reading, of course, we also have the reference to Pygmalion. Pygmalion, what's that story about? Who is Pygmalion? What was his job? He was a sculptor. So there's obviously a connection here between Sarrazin being a sculptor and Pygmalion being a sculptor. And of course, the famous story about Pygmalion is that basically he thought that the women of his time weren't up to his standard, right? Take of that what you will. So he instead decides, I'm going to create my perfect woman as a sculpture. And he then prays to the goddess Venus. This is in Ovid's version, and he prays to the goddess Venus, and she grants him his wish that his statue, Galatea, will come to life, and she turns out to be the perfect woman, and he marries her. Right? Of course, there's been many retellings of this story where Galatea has rather her own mind and does her own thing, but in Ovid's version, it works out well for Pygmalion. So you can see here, this is a classical scene that's been painted many times over, and of course is part of what Balzac is playing around with here, the way in which Sarrazin projects his own desires, his own ideals onto Zambonella, follows the same way that Pygmalion projects his own desires onto his own statue. Now we also have, as well as the classical references, we also, in the scene where Sarrazin kills the snake for Zambonella, is also a fairly clear biblical reference in this case. And it has to do with when Adam and Eve are thrown out of the Garden of Eden, right? Remember, they eat the fruit, they hide, they make clothes for themselves, then God comes and finds them and says, "Oh, I know what you did, I know why you're hiding, you're ashamed because you ate the fruit. Get out," right? You're grounded. No, you're thrown out of the garden, and having been thrown out of the garden, God sets up an angel with a flaming sword so they can't come back in, and he punishes them, right? So Adam's punishment, he says, well, before you guys could just eat the fruit off the trees and didn't have to work, now you, the man, are going to have to work. And he gives the woman 2 punishments. What are they? Anyone know? Right? So when they give birth to children, it's painful, right? And the other one is stated here, right? Which is that because it was a snake that tempted Eve, it says, from now on, women and snakes will hate each other. All right? So let me read out the verses. It says, "And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, tricked me, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Right? So this is clearly what Balzac is aiming for here, right? Is that, this supposed innate fear. I mean, I think men pretty much don't like snakes very much. I certainly don't. But according to this biblical reference, it's sort of supposed to be natural that there's this hatred between snakes and women, right? And because Zambonella has this fear, right? Sarrazin remembers this verse, we assume, from the Bible. It's like, oh, you must be a woman. You hate snakes. Oh, and I rescued you, right? And so he takes this as a sign that she really is, or that he really is a woman. Okay. So, as I said, I'm going to offer you 4 different ways of reading this story. Right? 4 different levels, 4 different versions. They're not incompatible with each other, just like we saw the 3 readings I gave you of Passion in the Desert. They could all be mixed together as different ways of looking at the story. The first one is to think of this as a story about the romantic style of the 19th century, of Balzac's time, and comparing it to the neoclassical style, in which Zambonella, right, is when she's young, he is young, let's say she is young and beautiful, then that's the peak, that's when neoclassicism has its time, right? That's when it has its value and its meaning. But then by the time it's the 19th century, by the time it's 1830, this style is not relevant anymore, right? It's become out of date. It's aged, and it hasn't aged well, right? Notice, that in part 1, the old man, who's, of course, we now know as Zambonella, is described as being like a sort of garish, old-fashioned painting. Very rich, very decorative, but also kind of gaudy and ugly. Right? It doesn't fit the times anymore. Right? So one way that we could interpret this story is that the old man, like when he's Zambonella, when he's young and beautiful, then yeah, he fits those times. He fits that 18th century style. He fits the neoclassicism. And it was the style for its time. But now in the 19th century, now in the age of burgeoning Romanticism in France, he's out of date. He doesn't fit anymore. He's dying. He's going. And in fact, this really is what happened to neoclassicism. It pretty much, as soon as Romanticism started to gain a foothold and started to be accepted, right, neoclassicism very quickly died out in French art. Right? Because it was mostly enforced by these institutions rather than it being like the decision of artists to pursue whatever they wanted. So that's one way of reading this story, as being a sort of Balzac's statement about the differences between the style of the previous century, the style of the 18th century of neoclassicism, and the fact that it doesn't have the same power, the same role, the same beauty, the same attraction that it once had. In fact, it seems ugly and weird and out of date to us to his time in the 19th century. Secondly, just like we saw there could be a political reading of A Passion in the Desert, we can also see this possibly as having a political angle to it as well, right? Insofar as we could see this as being a commentary about, just like we saw in art, the old way, the neoclassical way, so too we could see this as being a contrast between the old political system and the new political system, right? Now, in particular, remember this story is published in 1830, and we've talked previously about like what happens in French history around this time. Remember, in the end of the 18th century, from 1789, we have the beginning of the French Revolution. Then in the 1790s, Napoleon rises to power. Napoleon is the ruler for roughly almost 20 years. And then in 1815, he finally loses the Battle of Waterloo, right? He's finally carted off to an island to live out the rest of his days. And then, so what happens in 1815 was, remember, the Restoration, right? When they tried to restore the monarchy, tried to restore the aristocracy, basically to try and wind back the clock to make it as if the French Revolution never happened. But because of those years in between, because of the revolution, because of the Napoleonic years, that turned out to be a not very workable solution, right? And so the Restoration period was seen as a period that was very weak and unstable and sort of not a very productive or interesting period in French history, right? So remember, this story came out in 1830, and what happened in 1830 we saw previously was the July Revolution. Remember that July Revolution of 1830 overthrows the Restoration and shifts not to democracy but to a sort of a compromise style of monarchy, but more open to trade and to the middle class, right? So what we could see here is if you look at this cartoon, this is meant to be an allegory of the old system, what they call the ancien régime, the old regime, the old way of doing things, this is meant to symbolize the common people, right? And on his back, he's carrying two fat, parasites. The monarchy and the aristocracy, symbolized by this figure, and you can see by the cross, the church, right? And so he's bearing this huge burden of carrying these two things, and this is meant to be the burden of the common people. This is how the old system worked, right? So another way that we could see this is that we could look at the old man of Zambonella as, again, having a certain beauty and a certain resonance and a certain application in the 18th century, in its time. But that by the 19th century, right, by the time of the Restoration, by the time his old man, right, this style of politics, just like that style of art, of the 18th century doesn't really work anymore. It's become weak, it's become old, it's become decrepit, and it's on its way out. It's dying, it's going. Right? It seems to be part of the political allegory that we could see in this text. Now, of course, from our more modern perspective, one of the very interesting things about this text is some of the things it has to say about gender, right? And about how we think about the roles of men and women, because many of the things that it deals with, particularly in those scenes where we see Sarrazin at the party and after the party with Zambonella, right? He keeps on saying, "Oh, that's just like what a woman would do. Oh, you're teasing me like a woman does. Oh, you're scared of snakes like a woman is," right? And he has all of these ways of thinking about what a woman should be and what a woman's role in society and how a woman should act that are his projections onto Zambonella, right? And suggests to us, of course, that these notions of what gender is, right, and what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and to have those roles in society are a lot more fluid and a lot less sort of fixed by our biology than we might expect, right? So, of course, this is one of the more modern sort of readings of this text. Is it's playing around, it's asking us these questions about what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, what are those roles, how fixed are they, right, according to our society and according to our notions of gender. And then finally, to come to the most sort of the broadest view of this, is I've talked several times about this notion of projection, right? We saw it in, as I said, in the Sandman story, where we have Nathaniel projects his desires and his fears onto others, his fears onto Coppelius and his desires onto Olympia, right? And he sees in them what he wants to see, right? So in Coppelius, he sees a monster. He sees this evil Sandman because that's what he's afraid of, right? Not necessarily because he actually is those things. And again, Olympia, he sees in her this ideal, perfect woman because that's what he wants to see in her, rather than because that's what she really is. And Balzac seems to be doing the same thing here, right? He seems to be looking at very similar ways in which we, as human beings, project our own ideas, our own fears, our own desires onto other things and onto other people in particular in this story. One of the clues that he gives us here is actually a reference to the early German romantic writer Novalis. And Novalis wrote an unfinished novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, Henry of Ofterdingen, right? Am I saying it right, Gustav?
Ofterdingen, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So, and in this book, the main character Henry or Heinrich is a poet, although he's sort of like a superhero poet who seems to have the ability to sort of like superpowers to change reality and to do all sorts of things. But his quest, part of his quest, is to find, he says, a blue flower, right? And this blue flower represents for him like perfect, ideal beauty and perfection, right? And so because of the influence of Novalis' story, this symbol of the blue flower is something that has recurred over and over again, both in romantic literature and even in today's literature. So there's a famous novel from about 25 years ago called The Blue Flower, all about Novalis' life and so on. So you can see here when Zambonella goes to the after party, she changes out of her theater clothing, right, the opera stuff that she'd be wearing on stage. And we're told she had laid aside her stage costume and wore a waist which outlined a slender figure, displayed to the best advantage by a painter, and a satin dress embroidered with blue flowers, right? And of course, Balzac doesn't just randomly choose blue flowers. He's thinking here of that reference to Novalis, right? He's making that deliberate choice here. So there's four different ways of reading it. We could see it contrasting two different artistic styles, romantic versus neoclassical. We could see it as looking at two different political styles, right? The modern Restoration period and its decline, compared to its glory days of the previous times. And thirdly, we could see it as examining gender roles. And then lastly, in this one, we could see it as generally getting us to question how much of the reality around us do we really see and how much of it is the projection of our fears and our desires, right? These kinds of ideas. Okay, so let's turn now to our homework sheets and see what are some of the ideas that we can come up from there. Okay, Hiro, why don't you begin today?
Page 130, the first paragraph. I thought it was interesting because they're seeing this sort of someone that's estimating a moment, but I think it was just like you said, someone else isn't the ideal woman, but he was just wanting the idea of finding the
Yep.
ideal woman and force it on someone else. So because someone else is actually a man, it doesn't matter, like, because his ideal thing is crushed. So, yeah.
Yes. So, of course, as he says at the last sentence of that first paragraph, he says, I shall never cease to think of that imaginary woman when I see a real woman. He's like, when I see a real woman, I'm never going to idealize, a real woman again, because every time I'm going to think, she probably is fake, right, is what he's saying. I'm always going to be comparing every real woman to this fake ideal woman and thinking, can't be real. Too good, too perfect to be real, right? Now, this is important because even though we see there are many romantic characteristics to what Balzac is doing, Balzac's most famous role in literary history is, even though it might seem counterintuitive, he's also a realist, right? And we've seen already that there are certain elements of some of Balzac's stories that are not strictly real, right? So the Passion in the Desert, there are like love affairs between soldiers and friendly like lions or panthers or whatever they are in that story, right? They don't really exist. Or elixirs of life that can bring you back from the dead don't really exist. So it's not realist in that sense, right? But he is a realist in the sense that most of his stories are realistic, but also that they have this sense of like, we shouldn't just look for the ideal, right? The ideal is an illusion. It is fake, right? It doesn't exist. So if you look for the ideal instead of looking at reality, you're always going to end up in this position where you're always going to be disappointed because you're comparing something imaginary, some imaginary ideal, instead of just looking at the reality around you and accepting it for what it is, right? So that's why a lot of Balzac's stories can be a bit sort of like downbeat and melancholy and unhappy in their endings. Like this story, it's like sort of like this narrator is so hopeful that his strategy of seducing this woman is going to work out. And he gets to the end of the story and he's like, He's like, no, you just made me depressed. I'm not gonna have the affair with you. Right. Sharon, how about you?
Page 129.
Yep.
And that is a delusion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that he only thinks that it's a delusion after he discovers that that Zampanella is a man.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, like where he first sees her at the performance, he has like an idealized view of her. But later at the party, he learns of his faults and these things that he probably wouldn't like about her if like another woman had those characteristics. But then immediately after he discovers that she is in fact a man, he goes, it's a delusion. So I think it almost seems like that he fears that his love for Zampanella is a mark of like homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So
Certainly there's that fear there too, yep. But also notice too that he says to her earlier on, she's like, well, there's something I could tell you that would make you not love me anymore. And it's like, no, there's nothing you could possibly tell me. It's like, what is it? You want to get married? You want lots of money? You want me to do this or that? And she's like, no, it's not that, right? So like his scope of things for thinking about like for being sort of disillusioned, for being unhappy with her, he has some things that he's already imagined would be possible deal breakers, and he's like, no, I will overcome any of those obstacles. But when he finds out about this, then it becomes a whole different matter, doesn't it? Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. Chongwon? Yep.
Not the real woman. Love describes the most commonly appears in novels, and the description of the state of being in love would be one of them. But unlike later in the paragraph, in the beginning, the way how the author describes a person in love is less typical than other novels. The most done wonderfully, especially in a romantic way, because it describes how there becomes no distinction between two people,
Mm-hmm.
and because one is wholly engaged in seeing the other person who he is in love with, and it reaches a peak at the sentence denying more, there was no space between him and someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So and one of the things too that's quite different about Sarrazin, even though we've seen him in this neoclassical light, is that he has this very passionate nature too, doesn't he? Right. So his falling in love is not a surprise to us in many ways, because we've seen from even when he was at school. I mean, he wasn't falling in love at school, but he had a temper, right? He had this really inability to control his emotions in this way. So he even though he's set in sort of neoclassical 18th century context, nonetheless he has all these characteristics of a typical sort of emotional, passionate, romantic figure, doesn't he, as well? Okay, thank you. Eleanor?
I didn't really choose a specific part of the story, but I focused on the idea that Balzac kind of plays with how people get confused with love and infatuation, both with Saracen and Laz and Vanilla, and also with the narrator and the lady that he's talking to, and how in both of these stories they feel like they're in love at the beginning,
Yep.
but then something like changes that, and it's very fleeting, the feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and it disappears. So with like the narrating, it's a story. So like even though at the beginning of the story they're like kind of they feel like they're in love, at the end she's just like, I didn't really like your story, and I don't really like you, so whatever. And then with Saracen, he's like so in love with this lady, but then he's a man and he like freaks out, and there's all his feelings are gone. So.
Yep. And it's really important to think about the frame narrative in comparison to the story of Sarrazin, because in many ways they act as a sort of a mirror to each other, right? A lot of the similar things go on between them, like you said, like there's this feeling of disillusionment, but it happens in different ways, doesn't it, in each parts of the story. So it's Sarrazin turns out to be disillusioned about Zambonella, who is what he thinks is the woman, right? He turns out to be disillusioned by her, but in the frame story, right, it's the opposite, isn't it? It's the pursuer, it's the beloved, it's the woman who's sort of like, yeah, you're not the guy I thought you were. You're not worth having an affair with, right? So Balzac switches the roles, right, in the two parts of the story. So it's really important to consider both of those. Okay, Haeyoung, how about you?
I picked the part, page 129,
Mm-hmm.
middle of the page.
Yep.
Because this passage shows Zambinella turned out to be a man,
Mm-hmm.
and Saracen outraged to the truth that his lover was not a woman. It shows that his passionate love was illusion, which made him obsessed by beauty.
Yep.
And he was shocked because he thought Zambinella as the ideal woman of perfect beauty. And it makes me think about the notion of sexuality and gender.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally, people believe that beauty comes from the woman. And it seems clear to classify the role of woman and man, which was obviously opposite. But like Zambinella, castrato, beauty sometimes can come from the man.
Mm-hmm.
But homosexual was forbidden at that time, so maybe Saracen tried to kill Zambinella because he was afraid and confused that his love of Zambinella is a mark of homosexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and this is, as I said, one of the interesting things to compare, like that sort of Greek and Roman ideal, right? That is supposed to be inspiring this whole neoclassical movement, right? That's supposed to be the inspiration for it. And yet they're in denial of the fact that, male beauty and homosexuality were also a big part of that Greek and Roman classical culture, right? That part is sort of left out of neoclassical. They were like, we like their statues, let's not talk about that stuff, right? It's kind of how the neoclassicists approached it, right? So they're not really following the spirit of the Greeks and Romans, are they? They're sort of like, it's a fake version of the Greeks and Romans. They're taking the parts that they want and then leaving others out. And so Balzac is able to, like you said, he's able to play with that. Think back to, we don't have this example, but think back to the painting of Adonis that we saw in part 1, right? And remember that the narrator says, oh, well, that picture of Adonis being a man or a male god, right, and meant to be the epitome of male beauty, right? He then says, well, that picture was actually modeled on a female relative, statue of a female relative of the Dolantes, right? By which he means, we now know, he means it was modeled on Zambinella, right? And we now also know that Zambinella is kind of not really man or woman, so far as like, obviously not a woman, right? Even though it's made to dress like one on the stage, but also not really a man, given that she's been castrated, right? So occupies this in-between state that Balzac is able to play around with in this story. Okay, Isleta?
Actually, I really read this sentence that said, to talk of danger to a man in love is to sell him pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was really interesting because when the guys were kind of like warning him, like, don't go for La Zambinella, and he was like, oh no, I'm going to do it anyway. So it kind of like shows like the emotions of people when they're in love and how they can't really think rationally. And to just like, by saying there's like dangers, he makes them even more curious.
Yep.
And he's like, I still really like her and I really want to go out with her, even though they're like warning him not to. So it shows that he's not rational, that he's taken over by emotions.
Yes. Although this is one of the contradictions that Balzac likes to explore in a lot of his stories, is that like when things are difficult and when things are dangerous, they're also things that people tend to go after because they're like, it's more challenging, it's more exciting, it's more interesting to go after, in this case, like a woman who's difficult to get, right? And he's like, challenge me, I'll do anything, right? I'm more interested because you're hard to get. And then on the other hand, we often see in Balzac stories, if people are just given things, well, if things come easily to them, they're like, this is boring. Why do I have to have everything handed to me, right? And they become quickly uninterested. So remember, we talked about this in the Passion in the Desert story, where we talked about if the soldier had woken up next to like a tame animal, like a cow, right? That whole story would have been very different because he wouldn't be like, oh, this is scary. Oh, a cow, it might eat me. He's not going to, like that passion that arises between them, part of it is because it involves that danger, right, of the big cat of Mignon. Because she's dangerous, it raises the stakes of like what the relationship means to each of them, right? Whereas, if it hadn't had that element of danger, it would just be, oh, okay, there's another animal there, so what, right? And very similar phenomenon here happening with Zambinella. He's like, oh, this woman is difficult, hard to get, challenging, right? Oh, I'm going to pursue it more, right? So this is that sort of that paradox of human desire. The things we want things to come easily to us, but then when they do come easily to us, we're like, that was too easy. We don't want things to be challenging to us, but when they are challenging, we're like, oh, I will pursue it more. And Balzac uses this paradox, this contradiction in our natures over and over and over again in his stories. Okay, Jan?
I'll pick the second paragraph on page 122.
Mm-hmm.
This part of the story shows how Sarrazin fell in love with Sanguinella, and to me it seems that his passion toward her is so strong that he cannot control himself. And I noticed that the reference to Pygmalion
Mm-hmm.
was used in this passage.
Yes.
In my past experience, I read the story about Pygmalion, and it was interesting to find out that Sarrazin is also a sculptor, and he has affection toward Zambinella.
Yeah.
And so it implies that something will happen between Sarrazin and Zambinella.
Yep. Now, in the original story of Pygmalion, as I told you well, it's not the original one, but the most famous version from the ancient times is told by the Roman poet Ovid, right, in his big book Metamorphoses, which he tells all sorts of stories of like change and like things being changed into other things. So in this case, it's a statue being changed into a real woman. In that one, the story works out for Pygmalion, right? The gods, Venus in particular, grants his wish that, Galatea, the statue, name of the statue, becomes real, right? And she becomes his wife, and they live happily ever after in that story. But the retellings of this story of Pygmalion, right? This one, the most famous one, is by a play by George Bernard Shaw in the early 20th century, right? The movie My Fair Lady is based upon that play as well, right? Where we have people's attempts to create an ideal woman in their own image. They almost always end up failing, just like in this story, right? Where the warnings tend to be against the ideal, right? Against saying, well, you're not going to find an ideal woman. You can't create one out of a statue, right? They're always going to have, a mind of their own. No human being is perfect, right? All those sorts of things that are going to undermine the possibility, right, of there being this. So we have, another sort of way of retelling that story of Pygmalion, even though the whole story is not just a retelling of that, but we have that reference there, and overthrowing the original classical version of this, where things do work out well for Pygmalion. In the modern versions, they pretty much never work out well for Pygmalion. All right. Justin, how about you?
I picked the last two paragraphs on page 123.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
When the stranger kind of warns Sarrazin before going to meet Zambinella.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was kind of ironic, and it also foreshadows like the later part of the story.
Yep.
Because he said talks about it's a matter of life and death, and then Sarrazin says that if death awaited me on leaving the house, I would go more quickly. So he's eager kind of to die.
Yes.
And it does show that he does end up dying because of this.
Yes. Although he means it in the sort of the sense that I love her, I'll do anything, I would even die for her, right? He has this sort of over-the-top romantic passion for her, right? That suggests he'll die. What does the stranger call him at the beginning of that?
Senior Frenchman.
Senior Frenchman, right? So what does this tell us about the stranger? Where is he from? He's not from France. Because he's marking the fact that he's like, you're a stranger here, right? You're a foreigner, Sarrazin. So he takes him, hey, Signor Frenchman, right? Signor is from Italian, right? In this case. And he's saying, hey, Mr. Frenchman, hey, you, watch out. You don't know what you're in for, right? Now, remember we said to you that this is one of the reasons why Sarrazin doesn't know that Zambinella is not really a woman, is because he's from France, right? So there is this cultural knowledge that he's lacking when he comes to France. Sorry, when he comes to Italy, right? So as this Frenchman from the provinces, he's not, learned about all these different, he's not a particularly sophisticated guy, so he doesn't know about this cultural context when he goes to Italy. He doesn't know about castrati and so on, right? So he comes down to Italy. Everyone else knows, right? Everyone who is going to these theaters, they all know. And of course, when he goes to the party, does everyone there know? Does everyone there know that Zambonella is not really a woman? Yeah, they do. They kind of laugh at Zarazine, don't they? They're like, yeah, you have fun, right? And this is their joke, right? This is their sort of their fun. They're like, hey, why don't you go play with Zambonella? Yeah, she's a beautiful woman, isn't she, right? And so they're making all these, and he's like, oh, they must just think that she's a prostitute and that she's easy, and that's the reason that he comes up for, like, he misunderstands the whole thing, right? So he, as this Frenchman transplanted into Italy, has this difficulty in understanding this cultural context. He doesn't have enough knowledge to know about it, right? Now, think then in turn of our frame story, right? Why does this narrator know about this story about Zambonella? Where did he hear it? He tells us that he learned about it because it's a famous story in Italy, right? And of course, our narrator is French, right? So a narrator, he had gone to Italy, he'd heard this story there, so he knows about it. Do most people in France know the story of Zambonella? They don't, do they? Because we saw at the beginning when he's overhearing people's conversations and they're like, who are these Delante guys? Who's that old guy, right? Who are these people, right? So again, we have this kind of mirror between the frame story. In the Zarazine story, he doesn't know about the Italian culture of the castrati. So he goes there and he's naive about it and he has this incomplete information because he doesn't know about this Italian context. Similarly, we have the French who don't know about this famous Italian bit of history. They don't know about Zambonella and that background. And so they don't know about this particular context. And what Balzac does here is he tries to contrast the two cultures as two ways of looking at the world, right? So we're told, for instance, when the Italians go to the theater, to the opera, right, that they go there to watch the opera, right? They go there to see the performance. That's what they care about. Whereas he says, by contrast, when the French go there, they seem to be going there to watch each other, right? They say, oh, she's at the opera tonight. Oh, look what she's wearing. Oh, look, that guy's having an affair with that woman, right? And so they're going there to watch each other. And in fact, the final part of the story, where he says, where the Madame de Rochefide reflects upon this and says about how Paris in particular because it has this different mindset to how the Italians think, says that this story couldn't have happened here. It says Paris, this is in the second last paragraph of the story. It says, Paris, said she, is an exceedingly hospitable place. It welcomes one and all, fortune stained with shame and fortune stained with blood. Crime and infamy have a right of asylum here. Virtue alone is without altars. But pure hearts have a fatherland in heaven. No one will know me. I will have known me. I am proud of it. Right? So she's like, sort of like, this here, if this thing happened in Paris, yeah, no one would care. Right? Everyone would be like, different culture, different way of seeing things. But because of its context in Italy, this different way of seeing things, which just contrasts these different approaches. Right. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff happening in this story, a lot of ideas, a lot of things that we've seen. Some of them are familiar to us, like some of the points of similarity we saw with the way in which Nathaniel behaves in The Sandman, in the Hoffman story, but also some fairly modern things in this story, particularly the way in which it gets us to think about like ideas about gender and men and women, right? Those sorts of things make this story really resonate with us in the 21st century as well. Okay, so our next story for Thursday, is you know, a little bit longer, but then the story after that, I think, well, the two stories that we have after that, they're much shorter. So the two Poe stories next week, you'll find quite a bit shorter. So we have a vampire story coming up next. So, let's see, all these different kinds of weird monsters. Okay, thanks guys. Please sign your prep sheets and I'll see you on Thursday.